first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the usual office scent of cheap air freshener and old paper. No, this was different. It was thick, heavy, and cloying, like rotting fish mixed with stale alcohol. The stench crawled into my nose and settled deep in my lungs, making my stomach churn. I swallowed the nausea rising in my throat and forced myself to breathe through my mouth. Maybe something had gone bad in the vents, or maybe a client had stepped in something unpleasant on the way in. Either way, I made a mental note to get some candles. Then I heard the voice. "I don't need to be here," he said, fists shoved deep into his pockets, eyes averted. Oh, the magic words every psychologist loves to hear. Not. I tilted my head slightly, watching him. 16, maybe 17 years old. Dark hair flopping over his forehead. His shoulders were hunched, his whole body radiating the kind of defensive energy that screamed, "I don't trust you, and I don't want to be here." "So, why are you here?" I asked. "My mom thinks I need help." "But I don't." "What does she think you need help for?" Silence. His lips pressed together in a tight line, his jaw clenched. His eyes darted around the room but never landed on me. "Hey, I'll be honest," I said, keeping my voice light. "If you really don't want to be here, I'm not gonna force you. I don't hold people hostage. I work with clients who want my help." His eyebrows flickered upward in momentary surprise before sinking back into a scowl. "Just let me know why your mom thinks you need help. If it doesn't make sense, I can have a chat with her, let her know." He hesitated. Then, finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "She thinks I'm mad." Just 'cause I believe that, he trailed off, his gaze locked on the floor. I leaned forward slightly. "Hey, I've heard all kinds of things in this office. I'm not here to judge." He bit his lower lip, then exhaled sharply. "Every time I let myself be happy, bad things happen." Oh, good old cherophobia. Fear of happiness. They should include that in the DSM-5. "That's a very normal belief," I said. "Lots of clients I know have that fear. That once they allow themselves to be happy, something bad will happen." "I know that." "I know all that," he said impatiently. "But I'm different. It's true for me, not just a fear. You've been through enough to make anyone believe that. That's how the fear develops. People are happy, and then bad things happen. So they make that association. I know that too. I've Googled, you know." He rolled his eyes. I suppressed a sigh. "For me," he continued, "I have multiple proofs that being happy leads to bad things." He pulled out his phone and began scrolling. "I can show you." I wasn't expecting that. Clients with cherophobia usually had vague memories of their happiness causing bad things. But he had actual records. This could be useful. He shoved his phone at me. I read the logs, and the crease between my brows slowly deepened. December 25th, 2024, felt happy. Tried not to be, but it's Christmas. Tripped on wires of the Christmas lights. Christmas tree fell over. Squashed a few presents. December 26th, 2024, opened unsquashed presents. Got PS5. Celebrated until I remembered. Too late. Dad got drunk and knocked over and broke his wine glass. Mom stepped on broken glass. They fought. January 1st, 2025, New Year, felt hope. Pray for bad things to no longer happen in 2025. Cyclist knocked phone from my hand. Screens all cracked. October 1st, 2025, went out with family for pizza night. Got to order whatever I wanted, felt happy. Whole family had food poisoning after. January 21st, 2025, I've been so careful. Squashed every bit of joy. But today, pretty yellow hair tie girl said I have a cool shirt. Felt happy. Slipped and fell during basketball, hit my head. Doctor said to be careful of concussion. January 30th, 2025, laughed at a funny reel. Fly flew into mouth. choked and spat it out. February 2nd, 2025. Yellow hair tie smiled at me and I smiled back. Someone closed the door on my fingers. Hairline fractures, the doctor said. I looked up at him, then down at his fingers. They were taped up. This was a lot. I had dealt with obsessive thoughts before, and this definitely had elements of that, but his records were unnervingly thorough. It was as if he was gathering evidence for something. This is a series of very unfortunate events. It could seem like bad things really follow you around. But they definitely do. How are you so sure? He pointed at something next to him. You don't see it, do you? I stiffened. My pulse quickened. Not another one. I had dealt with enough clients who claimed to see things. Some were hallucinations. Some were real. And some, terrifyingly, were something else altogether. I forced my face into an expression of neutrality. Is there something that's supposed to be there? He hesitated, then exhaled sharply. I see a shadow. A dark thing. I can't see it clearly, but I think it's my father. His biological father was dead. That much I knew from the intake form. He turned his head slightly as if listening to something, then looked back at me, his face unreadable. It doesn't like you. A sudden chill ran down my spine. The stench in the room grew stronger. I swallowed and tried to keep my voice steady. Why doesn't it like me? Because, he said, eyes dark and hollow, you're trying to make me happy. The morning after the incident felt surreal. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as I sat up in bed, my head pounding from a restless night. The doctors had assured me my eye would heal, though it would take time. I still couldn't shake the lingering sensation of someone watching me. The memory of those jagged scratches on the hospital bed rail sent chills through me. I was released later that afternoon, and as I stepped outside, the cold air bit into my skin. The sky was overcast, a dense layer of clouds suffocating the light. It felt oppressive, pressing down on me like an omen. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and made my way home. The streets blurred past in a daze. The events of the previous day looped through my mind on repeat, each time feeling more absurd, more impossible. And yet, the dull ache in my eye and the bruises on my neck were undeniable proof that something had happened. Once inside my apartment, I locked the door and exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The silence was thick, almost alive. My apartment had always been a place of solitude, a retreat from the emotional burdens I absorbed from my clients. But tonight, it felt different. It felt invaded. I turned on every light and moved methodically from room to room, checking each closet, under the bed, even behind the shower curtain. Paranoia clung to me like a second skin. After confirming I was alone, I collapsed onto my couch, rubbing my temples. The scratches. The voice. The suffocating weight on my chest. My logical mind screamed at me to find a rational explanation. Stress-induced hallucinations. Trauma manifesting in subconscious projection. Something, anything, that fit into the framework of what I understood. But another part of me, the part that had seen too many unexplainable things, whispered a different truth. This was real. The vibration of my phone startled me. I grabbed it from the coffee table, my heart lurching as I saw the name on the screen. No caller ID. A lump formed in my throat. My instinct told me not to answer, but my fingers moved on their own, pressing the green button. Hello? My voice came out hoarse. Silence. Then, a slow inhale. A deep, rasping breath that sent ice through my veins. I see you. A low, guttural voice. Familiar. Wrong. The call disconnected. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering against my ribs. My body screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, anything, but I sat frozen, gripping my phone like a lifeline. The room suddenly felt too small. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against me with an invisible force. I swallowed hard, forcing air into my lungs. I needed to talk to him. Grabbing my keys, I bolted out the door. The taxi ride to my client's home was a blur. The streets outside flickered past, neon reflections bleeding into the darkness. When I finally arrived, I hesitated before knocking. The door opened before I could touch it. His mother stood there, eyes wide, a nervous tension lining her face. "I was just about to call you," she said, voice shaking. "Something's wrong." Dread coiled in my stomach. "Where is he?" She stepped aside, letting me in. The house was dim, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. She led me to his room. He sat on the floor, knees pulled to his chest, his taped fingers gripping his arms so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes, red-rimmed, hollow, snapped up to meet mine. "He's angry," he whispered. "I shouldn't have told you." I knelt beside him. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out." His breath hitched. "It's too late." A sudden gust of wind whipped through the room, though the windows were shut. The light flickered, casting erratic shadows. And then, the air turned heavy. The stench of rotting fish and liquor filled the room. The voice slithered through the darkness. "You should have stayed quiet." The storm raged outside, battering the small cabin with relentless winds and sheets of rain. Inside, Jonathan sat by the flickering fire, his mind consumed with the events that had led him to this moment. He had spent years preparing for this journey, yet nothing could have readied him for the reality he now faced. The map he had discovered in the library archives had been more than just a relic of the past. It was a key, and he was determined to unlock its secrets. The previous day had been fraught with uncertainty. As he navigated the dense forest surrounding the valley, he had encountered signs that he was not the first to seek the hidden city. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and even an old leather pouch filled with unfamiliar coins suggested that someone else had come before him, perhaps recently. The thought unsettled him. He had always believed that his quest was unique, that he alone had deciphered the clues left behind by ancient scribes. But now, doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He rose cautiously, heart pounding. Who could be out in this storm? He hesitated before unlatching the door, revealing a cloaked figure, drenched and shivering. "You must let me in," the stranger pleaded, voice barely audible over the howling wind. Jonathan stepped aside, allowing the figure to enter. As the hood was pulled back, he found himself staring into the determined eyes of a woman no older than himself. Her face was streaked with rain and dirt, but her expression was resolute. "Who are you?" Jonathan demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "My name is Evelyn," she said, unfastening her cloak and shaking at her wet hair. "I know what you're looking for, and I know you're not the only one searching." Jonathan's grip tightened around the hilt of his knife. "What do you mean?" Evelyn took a deep breath. "I've been following the same trail, deciphering the same clues. But there are others, dangerous men, who are after it, too. If we don't work together, we won't stand a chance against them." His mind raced. He had always worked alone, relying on his own intellect and instincts. But if she was telling the truth, if others were indeed after the treasure, then he needed an ally. He studied her face, searching for deception, but found only sincerity. "Fine," he said at last. "Tell me everything you know." As the fire crackled between them, Evelyn revealed what she had uncovered. The ancient texts spoke of a hidden passage beneath the valley, a labyrinth of tunnels that led to the heart of the lost city. But the entrance was guarded by traps, by illusions, and perhaps by something far more sinister. She had managed to acquire a fragment of an old manuscript detailing the path, but without Jonathan's map, her knowledge was incomplete. Jonathan unrolled his own parchment, placing it beside hers. As they pieced together the fragments of history, a clearer picture emerged. The passage was real, and its entrance lay closer than they had imagined, just beyond the river, where the old stone markers stood forgotten among the trees. A renewed sense of urgency filled the cabin. If they were going to reach the city before their pursuers, they had to leave at first light. The storm would mask their tracks, but it would also make the journey treacherous. Still, there was no other choice. Evelyn met his gaze, determination burning in her eyes. "We do this together." "Agreed?" Jonathan hesitated only for a moment before nodding. "Agreed." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, a new alliance had been forged. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: this was the turning point. And there was no turning back. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet town of Ravenglen, an unsettling tension settled over the air. The streets, usually bustling with life during the early evening, had grown eerily silent. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. Alexander stood near the old fountain at the town square, his mind racing with thoughts. The revelations from the past few days had shaken him to the core, and now he found himself at a crossroads. The knowledge he had gained could change everything, but it came at a great cost. Ever since he had discovered the hidden chamber beneath the mayor's residence, he had been unable to sleep. The ancient texts he found there spoke of a power long forgotten, a force that had been sealed away centuries ago to prevent its misuse. But something, had been trying to bring it back. And Alexander now held the key to stopping it. A soft footstep behind him made him turn sharply. It was Evelyn. Her face was illuminated by the flickering street lanterns, worry etched into her features. "You shouldn't be out here alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're looking for you." Alexander exhaled deeply. "I know, but we can't just run forever. We need to do something. We need to act before it's too late." Evelyn nodded, glancing around cautiously. "I think I found something useful. Meet me at the old chapel in an hour. But be careful, someone's been watching the house." Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the shadows. Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. If they were being watched, then time was running out faster than he had anticipated. The old chapel stood at the edge of town, abandoned for decades. Once a place of worship, it had become nothing more than a relic of the past, its stained glass windows cracked, its wooden doors barely holding together. The moment Alexander stepped inside, the scent of aged paper and damp stone filled his senses. Evelyn was already there, waiting for him near the altar. She held a worn leather-bound book in her hands, its cover embossed with unfamiliar symbols. "I found this in my grandfather's study," she said, opening it to a marked page. "It details everything, the rituals, the history, and most importantly, the warnings. The power we're dealing with, it's not just dangerous, it's uncontrollable. And if someone is trying to harness it, then we have to stop them before they succeed," Alexander finished for her, his jaw tightening. A sudden noise from outside made them both freeze. Heavy footsteps, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against stone. Someone was here. Evelyn quickly shut the book and stuffed it into her bag. "We need to leave. Now." Alexander nodded, but before they could move, the doors of the chapel burst open. A tall figure stepped inside, cloaked in darkness, their face obscured beneath a hood. "You've meddled too much," the stranger's voice echoed through the chapel. "It's time to put an end to this." Alexander's pulse raced. There was no turning back now. This was the moment that would define everything. The turning point had arrived. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the dense canopy of the forest, a sense of unease settled over the camp. The resistance fighters, weary from weeks of relentless skirmishes, moved with quiet efficiency, their actions guided by both discipline and desperation. It was clear to all that the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. Elara stood at the edge of the clearing, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains that loomed like silent sentinels. The weight of leadership bore heavily on her shoulders, but she refused to let it break her. She had spent the night poring over maps and intercepted messages, trying to piece together the enemy's next move. The oppressive force of the Dominion was tightening around them, and unless they acted swiftly, their rebellion would be crushed before it had a chance to truly rise. Darian approached her, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes alight with determination. "The scouts have returned," he said in a low voice. "The Dominion has fortified the Valley Pass. We won't be able to move through without a fight." Elara exhaled slowly. Then we must give them one, but not on their terms. She turned to the assembled leaders of the resistance. Riven, the grizzled tactician, crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. We can't match their numbers head-on. We need another way. Ilara nodded. We do. We'll lure them into the gorge. If we can control the terrain, we can dictate the battle. Leora, the group's strategist, traced a path on the map. There's a narrow passage here. If we can draw them in and trigger a landslide, we might be able to cut off their reinforcements. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. The plan was risky, but it was their best chance. As the sun reached its zenith, the resistance fighters took their positions. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made every breath feel heavy. Hidden among the jagged rocks overlooking the gorge, Ilara watched as the first wave of Dominion soldiers entered the narrow pass. A signal arrow shot through the sky. A thunderous crack echoed through the mountains as explosives planted along the cliffs detonated, sending a cascade of boulders crashing down. Shouts of alarm filled the air as chaos erupted below. The resistance fighters sprang into action, arrows and firebombs raining down upon the trapped soldiers. For the first time in months, the tide was turning. Darian led a charge from the eastern ridge, his blade flashing in the dim light. The enemy, caught between the collapsing terrain and the ambush, fought with desperation, but their discipline was breaking. Ilara leapt into the fray, her movements precise and deadly. She had spent years training for this moment, not just for revenge, but for freedom. The Dominion had taken everything from her, but today, she would take something back. The battle raged for what felt like hours, until at last, the enemy ranks began to crumble. A retreat was called, and the remaining Dominion forces fled into the forest, their morale shattered. The resistance fighters stood amidst the wreckage, their victory hard-won but undeniable. Cheers erupted, but Ilara knew this was only the beginning. They had struck a blow against the Dominion, but the war was far from over. As she looked out over the battlefield, she knew one thing with certainty: the tide had begun to turn. And they would not stop until they were free. As the days passed, tension in the air became palpable. The city, once a vibrant and lively metropolis, now resembled a place on the edge of collapse. Whispers filled the streets, spreading fear and uncertainty like wildfire. It was clear to everyone that something significant was about to happen, and yet no one could quite predict how events would unfold. Nathan stood by the window of his apartment, watching the city below. The neon lights flickered, reflecting his inner turmoil. He had always been a man of logic, relying on facts rather than instincts, but now everything he thought he understood was crumbling before his eyes. He clenched his fists, knowing that the moment of decision was fast approaching. That evening, a secret meeting was called. Nathan arrived at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The dim lighting and the echoes of footsteps on the concrete floor added to the gravity of the situation. Gathered around a rusted table were his closest allies, Sophia, Daniel, and Evelyn. Each of them carried the weight of their own doubts and fears, yet they remained steadfast. "We don't have much time," Sophia spoke first, her voice steady but urgent. "The authorities are closing in, and if we don't act now, everything we've worked for will be lost." Daniel nodded in agreement. "We've uncovered enough evidence to expose them. But we need to be strategic. If we release it all at once, they'll retaliate before the public can react." Evelyn leaned forward. "Then we need to plan this carefully. We need to control the narrative. Make sure that when the truth comes out, there's no way for them to cover it up." Nathan remained silent for a moment, absorbing their words. He had spent years uncovering the corruption hidden beneath the city's polished exterior, but now, with the final pieces falling into place, the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. "Then we do it," he finally said, his voice firm. "No more waiting. No more hesitation. We expose the truth." The room fell into silence as the gravity of their decision sank in. There was no turning back now. Each of them knew the risks, but they also understood that inaction was no longer an option. As they left the warehouse, the city stretched out before them, a sleeping giant unaware of the storm about to break. The next 24 hours would change everything. The night air was thick with anticipation. Nathan walked through the streets, his mind racing with possibilities. He was no longer just an observer, he was a participant in something much bigger than himself. The battle for the city's future had begun,